Mark Maxwell has spent the weekend digging through 7 years of Madison County court records to trace every charge, every plea deal, and every missed court date tied to DJ Marshall. This is the story that we aired just a minute ago, but his story aired last night at 6 o'clock, and his reporting raises some really tough questions about how someone with a long criminal history was still free before Friday's shooting. And Mark is joining us now. Mark, good morning. Thanks for being here, getting up early for us.
Yeah, happy to be here. But look, anytime a police officer is shot in the line of duty, these are the people that are sworn to serve and protect us, and we want to know, does our system serve and protect them?
Absolutely. So before I even get into this, can you tell people what the Safety Act was designed to do?
Well, sure. Long ago, it was actually in the summer of 2020 when all the George Floyd uprising was happening that momentum finally reached a boiling point in Springfield, Illinois, where the Legislative Black Caucus and a number of other progressive criminal justice reform groups finally felt they had the votes to pass something they've been working on for basically a decade, which was the fundamental question: a violent drug dealer, for example, who has a long criminal history shouldn't be able to buy his way out of jail and go on to intimidate witnesses.
Correct.
There should be a set of dangerous offenses, the state felt, that we can put you in jail before your trial and you cannot buy your way out. Now, to be fair, judges already had some discretion to say no bond, but they almost never used that. They always would put a high price tag on it. On the other side of that coin, the same progressive reform groups wanted to make sure that other people who were accused of low-level offenses that were nonviolent couldn't just be caught up in this jail cycle where they'd lose their job and their whole life would be upended over something that would amount to, at the end of their guilty plea or their conviction, no time served. So if you weren't going to end up in prison anyways, why would you have to spend 3 months in jail? That was kind of their thinking at the time.
Right. So the intent, and there's the intent, and then there's the reality of all these things, so in some ways. But what specific criteria under the Safety Act prevented prosecutors from detaining Marshall before the shooting?
That's a fair question, Michelle, and I think a lot of people in the Metro East across Illinois are asking it. I wish it were so easy that I could just hold up a piece of paper and highlight it and say this part right here, it needs to change because this is the reason why that officer was shot. Unfortunately, like in so many issues in crime and justice, it's just not that black and white. If we go back to the beginning, because there's just enough in this case, Michelle, for people on both sides of this debate to say, see, I'm right.
Right.
If you go back before the Safety Act, Marshall was introduced to law enforcement. There were criminal charges, and he bonded out.
Well,
so he got out under the old system.
That's what I was going to ask. Why were there so many multiple violent felony charges that were thrown out, that were dismissed?
As you go through the timeline, you get to that case where he did actually go to prison. So he goes to serve a 4-year prison sentence. Best we can tell, he served about 2 years. Maybe during the pandemic, he was allowed out of that 4-year prison sentence. Then later, he's on probation, so he pleads guilty yet again. So this is a guy who's out of prison, pleads guilty to, police say they found him with a stolen car, in possession or possible sale of a stolen car. It was then when they said, okay, we're not going to send you back to prison. We're going to put you on probation. That's a prosecutor's discretion. Prior to that, when he went to prison, they actually pleaded down on 3 other violent offenses. They basically dismissed them so that he would accept a plea deal. This is what prosecutors often do. They're like playing a game of poker to get you to plead. But even there, people who support the Safety Act say, see, the prosecutor could have been a little tougher on him there, and maybe he would still be behind bars. So you can point in a lot of different directions. Fast forward all the way to July of this year. Police in Collinsville pull him over, and police say they found drugs and a revoked license on him. Now, this isn't necessarily strictly a Safety Act issue at this point because he's already sentenced and under probation. So he's not violating the terms of his pretrial release, which is a Safety Act issue. He's now violating the terms of his sentencing probation.
Sure.
And so I think there are some real questions. Why didn't police in Collinsville move more quickly with the prosecutor to revoke his probation and send him to prison, not to jail?
Yeah.
And that's a question that Collinsville police and the prosecutor, Tom Hain, yesterday didn't want to really touch. They didn't want to get into that. And it's possible that under the law, there are some procedural hurdles that would have stopped them from doing that. The last thing I'll say is this, and this is the most tragic piece of it. Just 2 days before DJ Marshall is accused of pulling that trigger to shoot Officer Tyler Timmons, a court finally did say, you know what, we're putting out a bond for your a warrant for your arrest with no bond. Meaning, even if the Safety Act had been working, maybe it was working too slowly. The court eventually came around to saying, you no longer have a right to liberty. We're putting you in jail before your trial. and it was just 2 days later.
I was going to say, but it was a slow process. I mean, that there was something that slowed the process, right?
And we don't know. We don't know if it was a failure of law, a failure of enforcement. We're still trying to learn exactly what happened in those few months between July and December.
I mean, nonetheless, there's always red tape, there's nuance, there's all these gray areas too sometimes, right? It's slow going. Does this case expose weaknesses in both the old cash bail system, do you think, and the new Safety Act? What changes can even be considered now?
Well, I think there is no going back to the old system at this point, but there could be changes. Governor Pritzker has even signaled he's open to making changes. They've already changed the Safety Act 5 times since it was enacted. People don't often know that. So there could be changes. And we asked Prosecutor Tom Hain yesterday, what do you think some of the lessons we could learn from this case are? And he kind of said, listen, I'm not going there. We're not going to hold a legislative hearing when we're talking about the condition of this officer. So prosecutors can be a little selective in what they want to discuss and what they want to avoid talking about. But I do think this case raises really interesting points about how quickly does the system catch someone when they're clearly missing court dates, clearly not getting mail, clearly blowing through drug diversion programs and violating the terms of their probation. When you have a person who's a repeat offender, this wasn't even 3 strikes, it was like 13. So it raises real questions that I think lawmakers are going to have to take a hard look at.
Yeah, and you went through seven years?
Well, you know, it was just a couple hours of reading, a little light court document reading on a weekend.
Right. Well, hey, since you're here, thank you so much for that perspective, just for that context. And since you're here, we might as well plug your show, right? Are you going to be talking about this on your show too?
Well, we haven't quite booked all the guests for this week on the record. If you have politicians you'd like to see take some tough questions on this program, reach out to them. Let them know. But perhaps we'll hear from some of those folks, and we'll have a lot more as the conversation continues.
And are you talking to Nikki Budzinski?
We had her last week, I think, but we could have. I lose track now. I got to be honest with you.
I know. Sorry, I was reading the teas, but I thought maybe that you were talking about healthcare.
I think we talked with her about just last week. So it's crazy in this holiday season how quickly time flies. But we just had her on.
That I should say you can stream anytime. How about that?
Yeah, that episode's still streaming.
Yes,
right here on Great 5 Plus.
That's it. We love hearing that.